Hello and welcome to another Conversations with Dr. Westman. Today we're going to be talking about what happens when we stop eating sugar. Interestingly enough, the human body only has between 5 and 7 grams of sugar circulating in our body at any given time. And when we eat carbs, this increases the sugar load in our bodies. What happens when we stop eating sugar? We're going to find out today. We also have a special bonus for you, and it's brought to you by Dr. Westman. It is his new guide, The Truth About Keto and Heart Health. We'll also put a link for you in the description at the end of today's episode. So let's get started. And let's jump into today's questions. Eric, if we only have between 5 and 7 grams of sugar circulating in our bodies at any given time, what happens when we ingest sugar or carbs?
Well, when we eat sugar, it will raise the blood sugar, well, glucose more specifically, but even lactose and other sorts of sugar like milk sugar has glucose in it. So when you eat carbs, that's kind of putting it all together. Carbs meaning carbohydrates, the sugars and starches. When you eat those, the blood sugar goes up. And what's remarkable is the lack of understanding, even in the medical world, of how little glucose, how little sugar there is in the blood. Consider, for an example, an apple has 20 grams of sugar, let's say carbohydrate, 20 carbs, total carbs, for keeping it precise. 20 carbs in the apple is 4 times as much sugar is in your bloodstream at any given moment. So one apple, if you don't have this huge insulin response to keep the sugar down, one apple could double your blood sugar easily. And of course, someone with diabetes measuring the blood sugar, and now you have these monitors on here, that's what they say. Well, the apple raises my blood sugar and my doctor says that's fine. No, it's not fine. So if you want to optimize your blood sugar, your glucose, don't have so much blood sugar rising food, which is the carbohydrate. So eating carbs raises the blood sugar.
Now, let's get a little bit more technical. What also happens in the pancreas? The pancreas secretes insulin. Is this what happens as well? So you eat an apple. So right now, you've got between 5 and 7 grams of sugar in the blood circulating at any given time. You eat an apple, that increases the load maybe 3 or 4 times. The glucose goes up and the pancreas secretes insulin.
Yeah, and the perspective has changed for me. I was taught, and most doctors are taught, that it's normal for a rise in blood sugar after eating a meal, and it's normal for insulin to be secreted from the pancreas to lower the blood glucose and to help get the glucose into the cells. I've shifted in my thinking now that while it may be normal, meaning that's what happens in most people, it's not optimal. You see, the blood glucose is regulated in a very tight control. And if it goes up a little bit, the body doesn't like that. It sends out this insulin to lower the blood glucose and it puts it in the cells, but that's not optimal. So this insulin spike or insulin response to lower the blood glucose is a pro-fat storing, pro-inflammatory sort of response. So that anytime you eat even an apple, even if you don't have diabetes, it raises that blood glucose, raises the insulin to keep the glucose down, and then insulin tells a signal to the liver to make fat and to store fat. So it's actually not only causing you toward diabetes, it's causing you toward fat storage and gaining weight just from eating an apple.
So before we get into the differences and what happens to our body, in our body when we stop eating sugar, I want to try and help everyone to understand, and you can help us with this. Are carbs and sugar the same thing? So in other words, some people might say, well, I didn't eat sugar. But eating carbs, is carbs treated the same way as sugar? Does it turn to sugar?
Yes, and so that's important to realize in the teaching out in the internet. You have to be precise about the language if you're going to say glucose and fructose, and you're going to find people making it overly complicated. And so this is my method of teaching people. I've done it for over 20 years now at Duke University, is to try to keep things really simple. And if there's a bit of glucose in this, in an apple, I'm going to say count that as a carbohydrate, as a glucose raising substance. And starches, which, potatoes, pasta, rice, really these starches are just glucose molecules all connected together. Our body digests them into glucose. And that's why when you eat potato, pasta, rice, bread, your blood glucose goes up like eating an apple. And so if you look at sugar-free out there, sugar-free, but it has a lot of starch in it, it's not carbohydrate-free, it's not carb-free. So that my simple way of teaching and thinking in my own mind is put all the carbs together, because a subset, a portion of the carb will be glucose, and that will be raising the blood glucose. And so you don't want to have anything to raise your blood glucose much, because then your body sends out insulin to keep the blood glucose down. And so I think really of all the carbs in the same manner, especially if you're trying to do a keto diet, that you want to keep the sugars, starches, whether it be glucose or starch, or in other words, keeping it simple, count all the carbs together.
Now, we've spoken about what happens when you eat these sugars and carbs. We know what you've just explained that to us. But what happens now when we stop eating sugar and carbs?
Well, the remarkable thing, again, that most doctors and medical trained people don't know, is that the body makes its own glucose and makes its own sugar without you eating anything. I mean, imagine we talked a bit about these reality shows where people go out into the wilderness or on a deserted island and they really don't eat anything, and they start losing their body fat fast. Well, they also maintain a blood glucose level without eating anything. So your body can make glucose on its own without you, and fructose and all the other sorts of sugars that you need, without eating sugar. Now, I don't want you to go without eating things like on these reality shows, and your body makes plenty of glucose and fructose and other sugars, ribose, for example, from the proteins and fats that you eat. So your body's going to have a blood sugar like this if you don't throw in extra sugar, and then your blood sugar goes up and insulin goes up to lower the blood sugar. That we call that the roller coaster of glucose when you're consuming carbohydrates. So your body will find its own way to make the blood glucose steady like this if you don't eat carbohydrates.
So, and how long would that take, Eric? So let's say, for example, I'm a carb burner, I eat carbs, I eat sugar, and then all of a sudden today I decide I'm no longer eating carbs, and today is day one. What happens inside the body? In other words, when, will there be a result of insulin immediately? Will there be a result of my glucose level dropping immediately? What happens immediately when I stop eating carbs?
Yeah, well, of course, there's a range of time course for different people, depending on your underlying insulin resistance, your underlying metabolism. But for most people, this happens in just a day or two, this shift. Because if you're consuming, let's say you burn a couple thousand calories a day of energy, and you stop consuming carbohydrate in the food and drink, your body needs 2,000 calories for the next day, and we only store about 1,000 or 2,000 glycogen calories, which is the sugar storage. So it only takes a day or two for your body to shift over to fat burning. Now, if you have diabetes, you're on a journey of a couple 100 pounds to lose, it may take longer. That's a more tough metabolism. But for most people, it's just a day or two. You stop eating sugars, your body figures out how to burn its own fat. It happens pretty fast.
So that's the immediate results of stopping the sugar and carb. What happens, let's say, after a week? What happens after a month?
Well, remember the insulin response to keep the blood glucose down starts healing, starts getting better. If you're so insulin resistant or you had diabetes, you might have elevated insulin levels all day long. So these start coming down. If you're otherwise normal and healthy, the insulin reduction will happen almost immediately. And that means you don't get the pro-inflammatory effects of insulin. You don't get the growth effects of insulin, like growth factor. All of these things we are learning now even will shorten life. So the longevity in different animals and different models like worms and rats, animals live longer if your insulin level is lower. So the lower the insulin, the better in terms of how you feel, less inflammation, and even in how long you'll live. Of course, that's not worked out in humans yet. It takes a long time to do a study of a human lifespan because we, in general, live so long. But the biomarkers are there to suggest you want to keep the insulin level down. And one way to do that is to keep the food that raises the glucose and insulin to a minimum in our diet.
I've got one last question for you, and that is, if we take the sugar and carbs that we've stopped eating sugar and carbs. We've been on this lifestyle for a number of weeks and months. Is there an optimal time period where our bodies become more efficient at burning fat, or is it the same? So, for example, someone that stops eating sugar and carbs after 1 week versus someone that stopped after a year. Is the person that stopped after a year, are they more efficient at burning fat?
I think so. You know, the clinical knowledge that I have treating people with illness, there's a wide range of how fast things change. Sometimes I have to reduce insulin by 50% on the first day when someone starts a diet like this, stops eating carbs, and they're taking insulin. I have to change the medications immediately for those folks. Other people, let's say you're trying to win a marathon race, and this was chronicled in a movie called Serial Killers 2, C-E-R-E-A-L, not S-E-R-I-A-L, serial killers, where these elite athletes optimized their fat burning, and they did special testing on themselves, and it took them 6 months to optimize the fat burning to the degree of an athlete who wanted to, they went into a rowboat and rowed from San Francisco to Hawaii. It's all in this documentary film. It's really kind of incredible, but it took them because they wanted to do such an extreme amount of exertion in their bodies. They waited 6 months until they were totally fat adapted. But I would say for most people, it's a matter of days to a couple weeks when you start getting the benefits of the fat burning. You don't have to wait that long to get it. And, you know, the studies on people doing this for years now are just being done now. And so that's where we're learning more and more about what happens to people. And it's actually looking really good. Yeah, that it's looking better and better as we study a keto lifestyle longer and longer.
Fantastic, Eric. Well, thank you so much for helping us understand what happens to our bodies when we stop eating sugar. And that's all we have time for today, folks. But remember that we have a special bonus guide for you today, and which is the truth about keto and heart health, brought to you by Dr. Westman. If you're worried about cardiovascular risk, this is one guide that you definitely don't want to miss. If you'd like to learn more about our upcoming courses, you can find us at adaptyourlifeacademy.com. Eric, thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to catching up with you again for another great episode next week. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.